This, coaching draft is what I'm calling it. Can happen. It absolutely can happen. And it should happen. And I think that we've had some great conversations this week already with what can really transpire these last 3 weeks that couldn't happen after this weekend. Like what are they doing? What are the teams and the coaches doing that is so critical right now? Nothing. If the NFL just puts a blanket, timeline together and a plan together, you can actually turn this into another moneymaker. They could. You could turn this into a legit coaching draft. You could have a draft at the end of the season and you get to see where all these coaches are going. You could put everybody up, on a stage, and you're not going to tell, who's hired and going where, but everything's kind of done behind the scenes, and you legit do it like a draft. Now, obviously, they'd have the choice of where they're going, but we'll get into that, I guess, at the end. Okay, so here we go. 2023-2024 hiring cycle. That's what I took a look at. I did not really go deep into this year, but we'll talk about a couple. And the framework of this is I wanted to take a look at some of the coaches that were hired and when they were interviewed, and were they in the playoffs? And did they lose the playoffs around the same time that they were getting interviewed? Kind of the same theme that a lot of you in the chat tonight and watching later were communicating this week, that this was bullcrap. We felt like there too much attention was put into these, 10, 12 different interviews these guys went through, right? I mean, combined was a lot of time taken away from the team. And so I thought, let me take that. Let's put it to use here and see if we can find any similarities with any of the other coaches that were hired. So I'm going to start right away with Mr. Dan Quinn, former Cowboys defensive coordinator. Now, Ron Rivera was fired as the Washington Commanders head coach last season, and they obviously didn't make the playoffs. And on January 15th, it was reported that Dan Quinn had 5 interviews set up via Zoom starting on January 17th. Now, obviously, Dan and his agent and lawyers and his group, they were notified before the 15th of January. If everybody found out on the 15th, and it was reported by Ian Rappaport and Tom Pelissero and the normal crew, they knew that these interviews were set up before that. Well, it just so happened that they had a playoff game against Green Bay on the 14th of January. So it was reported on the 15th that all these interviews were set up. They had a playoff game the day before, and they got their asses kicked, 48-32. Now, I'm going to go through just the list of interviews he went through. So on the 17th, he was interviewed by the Panthers and the Titans. On the 18th, he was interviewed by the Commanders and the Seahawks. On the 19th, he was interviewed by the Chargers, and then he was hired February 1st by the Commanders. Now, February 1st is key because that is just before the Super Bowl. So it's well after, all of these playoff games post the AFC-NFC Championship game. And I think that that's the key weekend is the AFC-NFC Championship game, and I'll explain why at the end. But you notice, none of these interviews were set up prior to the first playoff game, which won't be the same with all these other coaches. Now, the prep, the amount of work that goes into these interviews, it's massive, right? You're a coach, you do well at what you do, but to prep for a head coaching position, you've got to come with it. Like, you're one of 530 that have ever done this in the history of humankind. Like, there's only been 530 head coaches of an NFL team ever since the NFL was created. It has got to be one of the most rarest jobs in the world. So when you think about all these interviews that they're going through, for me, it's the psychological component that this individual is interviewing, and the players, it can also affect their attitude, their psyche, but I think it's the psychological component to an individual interviewing and the players that are affected by this. And the reason why I say that is the Cowboys had their first playoff game versus Green Bay, like I said, on January 14th. They didn't just lose, right? They were humiliated, 48-32, kind of like we were this past weekend. Quinn served as Dallas's defensive coordinator the 3 seasons before that. The Cowboys ranked a combined 5th in points and 7th in yards under Dan Quinn. The Cowboys led the NFL with 93 forced turnovers. This matchup, the Cowboys defense gave up 7 touchdowns in the season-ending loss. The unit gave up 415 yards, 143 on the ground, 118 of which went to running back Aaron Jones, who found the end zone 3 times in that game. The 48 points against were the most allowed by the Cowboys under Dan Quinn ever. You can't call everything a coincidence when it happens, when the theme is the same for most of the teams that that have these coaches that are going into this position of having to interview during the playoffs, and they lose in epic fashion. This one is so similar to the Lions situation. We got humiliated. We did not look prepared. Dan Quinn did not look prepared in that game against the Cowboys. Now, obviously, all of us wanted the Cowboys to lose because what happened to us, down there in Dallas, or against Dallas. But I think it's this first picture that kind of points, that something ain't right here. his head had to have been elsewhere. How do you have that great of a defense and you're going in and losing to a first-year quarterback in Jordan Love? Doesn't make any sense. The next guy that I'm going to point to here is Dave Canales. So Dave Canales was the former Tampa Bay offensive coordinator. Now, he was interviewed on January 18th, and then he lost to the Lions on the 21st of January. His second interview was scheduled for January 22nd. He was hired by Tampa Bay. Dave Canales was hired on January 25th. Pretty quick turnaround, right? 7 days after his first interview, he's hired. So Tampa had their first playoff game in the wild card versus Philly, and they won 32-9. And on January 15th. And then they come to Detroit on January 21st, and they lose 31-23. On January 22nd, like I said, it was reported by Ian Rappaport that Dave Canales was scheduled for his second interview just 24 hours after losing to the Lions in the divisional round. Obviously, the Lions defense was nowhere near as good as Philly was last season. And I'm not discrediting what our Detroit Lions team did in that game. But something should be noted here, that the teams that lose coaches and are interviewing during the playoffs almost always lose a game in the playoffs. Almost always. And it's right around the time that they're interviewing. I think we're 2 for 2 now. Next up is Raheem Morris. He was the former Rams defensive coordinator. Now, playoffs, obviously, on January 14th, had to come to the Lions. They lost, as we know, 24-23. But he was interviewed by the Panthers on the 17th of January, the Commanders on the 18th, the Seahawks on the 19th, the Chargers on the 20th, and the Falcons on the 20th. And he was hired by the Falcons on the 25th. Again, just 8 days after his first interview. And he had all of these interviews within, 3 to 4 days after the playoffs. You got to think that this stuff was on his mind. Now, this one doesn't really point a good, smoking gun, but I at least have to throw it in here to kind of level things out a little bit. Next up, we'll talk about a guy we're very familiar with, Aaron Glenn. Now, Aaron Glenn interviewed with the Falcons on January 19th. His second interview was scheduled that day for a future date. He also interviewed with the Titans on January 19th. This is 2024. It's last year, by the way. He interviewed with the Chargers on the 20th. He interviewed with the Commanders on the 20th, and his second interview was scheduled that day for January 30th. Ben Johnson interviewed with the Panthers on the 19th. The Titans requested an interview. The Commanders interviewed him on the 19th as well, and the second interview was scheduled that day for January 30th. The Chargers interviewed him on the 20th. The Seahawks interviewed him on the 20th, and a second interview was scheduled for the 29th that day. And the Falcons interviewed him on the 21st. As you know, the Lions had the first playoff game on January 14th. The divisional round was on the 21st, and the NFC Championship game was on the 28th in Santa Clara. Both coaches interviewed in the days leading up to the NFC Championship game. They interviewed right around the same time as the second game that year in the divisional round. And according to this tracker that I will post in the description, Ben interviewed the day of the divisional round with Atlanta, and both coaches had interviewed immediately following the NFC Championship game, which were scheduled way in advance on the 29th, the 30th. Both coaches were supposed to be interviewed. Now, Ben did remove his name from the Commanders. Obviously, we know that was a big to-do. And the Seahawks, he withdrew, but Aaron Glenn did not. So to think that Aaron Glenn, again, didn't have his mind elsewhere. We had a great first half against the 49ers, collapsed in the second half. We had great offense in the first half, good defense in the first half, both fell apart in the second half. Again, was their mind elsewhere? That's the question that we're trying to answer. So next we'll talk about Mike Macdonald. Now, he interviewed on January 11th per the team with the Panthers. He interviewed on the 12th with the Falcons, the 13th with the Titans. Again, this is last year. He had 3 interviews before the divisional round where they beat Houston. The AFC Championship game was on January 28th. He had interviews scheduled for the 29th with the Commanders and the 30th with the Seahawks. So just a couple of days after, the next day and the 2 days later, he had interviews already set up after the AFC Championship game. Subsequently, they lost on the 28th, 17-10. The Ravens ended up hiring Mike Macdonald on January 31st. Ian Rappaport reported that Seattle would have been, and get this, this is kind of where I'm going to end it here for this, but then I'm going to go into a little diatribe, I guess. But Ian Rappaport reported that Seattle would have been content, maybe a little restless, but content to wait until the conclusion of the Super Bowl to interview Mike Macdonald. Instead, John Schneider, the Seahawks owner, was sitting with him that Tuesday on January 30th, 2024, for their first in-person interview. This proves to me that owners of NFL franchises see the benefit of waiting and are willing to wait. So my thought process here is not really far-fetched to believe the process can be changed. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a Lions fan. I'm not just saying this because, I feel like I have a vendetta against the NFL for losing, Ben and Glenn. It's because I think it makes sense. That's why I'm doing this. And that's why I did research to see if what I'm thinking even makes sense. Well, an NFL billionaire was willing to wait. If he's willing to wait, probably makes sense. He's got just a couple of more zeros in his bank account than I do, so he must know something. So when we look at what happened this season, the 2025 hiring cycle, I don't think that anyone really agrees that the interviews affected Ben and Glenn. Some point to the yards gained in this game, that, over 500 yards of offense and the offensive explosives and, how many points we put up. And then I would say this. I think the offense would run and do those things without Ben. It's the players making the plays after the play is called. It's the players who are executing on the field, not the coaches. Jared Goff, in my opinion, could call a complete game. And I would expect that he could do just as well with or without an offensive coordinator chirping in his ear all day. You want your quarterback to be able to call plays. You want your quarterback to be able to recognize plays. This was a Dan Campbell offense anyway. I still think that we would have executed the same had it been Ben or not. Now, defensively, this was the worst performance the Lions had all season. It was just a trash game plan. It didn't make any sense. Everybody looked confused very often in this game. In the scheme to blitz against the best quarterback against the blitz that season, that had to be the dumbest thing I have ever witnessed in the last 4 seasons. Had the defense had Aiden Hutchinson, Derek Barnes, Carlton Davis, and Malcolm Rodriguez in the game, and maybe Amik doesn't get injured, well, then maybe that plan would have worked. And honestly, it probably would have. The difference here is when you look at like what the Buffalo Bills did, they're almost 100% healthy as far as who's on the roster in their game against the Ravens. They were almost healthy all season. They could do the things that they did with blitzing against Lamar because they had the strength of being healthy and they had their top tier players in the game to make the plays. Asking third stringers for the Lions to play at a first string level was asinine. And to put them in the position to blitz and allow these big explosives to happen and then have them play catch up and then put the ball in Jared Goff's hand and say throw it 40 times so that we can get caught up, that's the result of having a bad defensive plan against the Commanders. That you're going to have to throw the ball, and we're all bitching about running the ball, but that's the reason why. When your defense lets up all the points, yeah, the turnovers don't help. But I think that there's cause and effect here, right? There's turnovers turn into points. Well, now you get behind, but then Aaron Glenn is blitzing out of his mind, which is allowing the Commanders to score easy and at will, and then you got to get the ball back, and you're trying to catch up, so Jared's got to try to throw it. He's trying to push the ball. It's just a domino effect, one after another. And I think had Ben and Glenn probably not had to go through this process until after the AFC-NFC Championship game. Granted, even if they were going to the Super Bowl, they had 2 weeks to get ready, a full 2 weeks to get ready, to go through a couple of interviews early in the week, and then get prepared for the Super Bowl. Totally different game plan. They had their interviews, with the days, kind of leading up to this game. So my take on psychology of the interview process is this. Some of you are probably going to be like, what the hell is he saying? But just bear with me for a moment. It'll probably make sense. I wrote this today. It is kind of nuts. To me, it's like this. Imagine you're married, right? You have a daughter and you have a son, and they're in their young teens, 14, 15 years old, let's say. One day your wife just writes on the refrigerator calendar, "This is our last day together as a family," and then circles it. For no reason, right? She circles it for no reason other than she just wants to go interview new candidates to be her new husband. And that week, your son gets into a fight at school. The daughter starts dating the school bully that nobody likes. And to make matters worse, your wife starts putting on perfume and makeup that she wore when you first met, and she hasn't done that in years. Gets her hair done differently for the first time in a decade. Man, you're just burning up at this point, aren't you? Now tell me, that situation as a man, right? Women could probably relate in a different way. That wouldn't mess with your psyche and your children's heads, right? Your children being the players in this story. And I know that it's a crazy analogy. I get it. But I think it's one that we can all relate to in a way, and that's kind of why I chose it. It's the same analogy that can be exactly what this process does to the players and the coaches involved in the process. The head coach is the husband in this case. Like I said, the coordinators are the wife, and the players are the kids. There's no way that anyone could tell me that the coordinators' heads are not elsewhere, thinking about other things, not 100% focused. And honestly, it shouldn't be. They shouldn't be, because you have to be thinking about these things that are extremely important, life-changing things that are happening quickly to you, your family, those around you, your friends, people that you've made relationships with. If you could maintain 100% focus on just the next game ahead, well, that has to be a bit of narcissism, because I don't think that it wouldn't bother anybody. I think it would bother everyone. If it didn't bother you, that would be kind of weird. If it wasn't on the front of your head, that would be kind of weird. So said another way, or another way to say it, It's like this. If you knew you had a winning lottery ticket in your pocket and you went to work anyways the next day, and your boss says, or does something that maybe you don't agree with or you don't feel like doing, it's a whole lot easier to walk out knowing financially you're going to be fine. So if Ben knew he was hired no matter what in Chicago, he was playing that day with a winning lottery ticket in his pocket, or the I don't give a rip attitude and put it all out there on the line, and maybe he just was not dialed into the plan that he normally would have stuck with, running the ball on 3rd and 1 at the 17-yard line. So that's my take. Here's the fix. The NFL should have a coaching draft. They can do whatever they want with it. They can make it a little draft like you do on draft day, where you have all the teams and the coaches on a stage, or they don't, right? They could just a day, just designate a day. You put a stake in the ground, you say nobody interviews until everyone's out of the playoffs, and it's the week before the AFC and NFC championship game. If your team is out of the playoffs, you can interview. And then the next week after the AFC NFC championship game, whatever teams are left, again, you can interview. And then the final interviews, if you want anybody that's on the Super Bowl winning teams, well, those can come after the Super Bowl. But you can't hire anybody until the Tuesday following the Super Bowl, which would be February 10th this year, or February 11th this year. That's why I chose that. That's why I'm calling it the coaching draft. That way, the people that are saying, well, what about everyone else that, is just kind of sitting and waiting? Or what about everybody else that got an early jump on the interview process? What about, the guys that have to wait? Exactly right. Everybody should have an opportunity, and everybody should be able to hire on the same day. And you're going to go where you belong. Teams are going to have enough opportunity to interview all the people that they want to interview. And it'll all work out. Now, maybe that makes things too fair. I don't know. Maybe that's not enough for capitalism, but I think it makes it fair for everybody involved. And I think it takes all the stress away from all the coordinators that are having to deal with playoffs and not their next job. So that's it. That's the coaching draft. Will the NFL do it? Probably not. Will they change anything? Probably not. We're just going to have to continue to deal with it. Now, how do we move forward? That's the question we're going to talk about next. Who's available? Who are some of the top offensive and defensive coordinators still available? I've got a few names written down here. I'm interested to hear what you guys think. What names that you guys have come up with. I have not dipped into college yet. There's so much going on at the college ranks. Who knows? But now I'm going to wind back in the chat. Let's see what you guys are talking about. Harpazzo says this is a Roger Goodell issue. It seems like the Lions get screwed and the NFL does something. I don't know. I think this is an every team issue. I think every team's had to deal with it. It's just our time, right? That's all it is. It's just our time. Let me get. Oh, you guys didn't hit 75 likes yet. We're almost there. Drew Schoenbeck says not the right time for any distractions. When you're in the playoffs, not sure if Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn had their minds 100% on the last playoff game. School for our kids, house to be moving to. Yeah, exactly. You've got a ton of things going on. To make matters worse, people act like this is just a normal interview. You have mountains of paperwork I'm sure you have to go through, or your attorney does. And then you have to have conversations with your attorney. And then you got to have conversations with your wife. And then you got to have conversations with everybody else around you. And then, oh, by the way, you're trying to poach just about everybody from the organization you're with currently. And then you're trying to assemble a team, because part of going into this interview is you have to go in and say, yeah, I think that I can bring this guy with me. This will be my OC, my DC, and down the line they go. So they're making phone calls. They're probably doing research about guys. They're trying to figure out who does what well. It's constant. It's not just the 2 or 3 hours they were in that interview. It's probably the 12 or 16 hours they were in that interview. It's the 12 or 16 hours before that they prepared. And then it's the 12 or 16 hours after that they're making phone calls and sending off emails and doing whatever else they got to do. You're talking days worth of work here that is distracting them away from being prepared. It's not just the interview. It's more than that.
You can do it!